Woodcraft since 1928, providing traditional and modern woodworking tools and supplies to generations of craftsmen. Woodcraft, helping you make wood work.
Well, hello. Come on in. My name is Rick Butz. Welcome to wood carving. Today we're doing one of my favorite projects, this Adirondack hermit. This carving is detailed from an old photograph dating back to the 1800s. I think I've got a picture of him kicking around here. His name was French Louie, and he was a hermit who lived up in the Adirondacks, about 100 years ago. And the thing that's neat about this project is the whole thing is done with really just a knife. Let me show you how we get him started. I'm using a piece of white pine here that I've taken and drawn on the outline and the profile. Now I got those from looking at an old photograph of Louie and then making a paper pattern of each side. And it's just a simple matter of taking this and tracing this onto one side and then taking the other and tracing it on like so. The trick in doing this is to cut out the profile first, because that way it gives you a flat side on each side, and that'll fit in the vise without turning around. If you cut out the front side first, you've got this crook for the elbow, and that won't clamp in the vise very well. So you just put this in here and saw away with a handsaw or whatever, and eventually you'll come up with a block that looks something like this guy here. And I've taken a pen and drawn on some of the lines here for its elbows and where it's going to be. Then it's just a simple matter of finding a place to sit, getting your whittling knife, and carving away. The knife I'm using for this is an old German chip carving design. Now you can also use a pocket knife if you want, but I find that this wooden handle tends to be more comfortable for long periods of time. Don't get a real big blade. You really don't need a blade that's any longer than say 1.25 inches or 1 inch long. And then it's just a simple matter of carving away everything that isn't French Louie. I usually start carving by rounding off all the corners, and that gives you kind of a nice starting point. When you're carving, there's a couple of different techniques that you can use. The most common one you'll be using is sort of the basic whittling stroke, which is just putting your thumb against the block of wood, bracing it there, then slowly closing your hand, and that draws the knife through the wood. Now notice I'm not using my arm or elbow or any power behind this. It's all done with just the hand. Try to keep your thumb out of the line of fire here. If it's something you're not used to, what you might do is take and wrap a Band-Aid around your thumb. That gives you a little extra insurance if you get too close. But with a little practice, that's not much of a problem. Now notice, I'm not doing this with a knife. Don't ever do that where you pull it towards you, because if that knife slips, it can cut your shirt or anything that gets in the way. So we just take this little paring cut and carve all around them. I remember once I taught a class, and there was a gal in this class, a really nice, sweet little old lady who, I think she was in her early 80s, and she said she'd always wanted to carve and decided she wasn't going to start any younger, so she came to the class and made this beautiful little duck. And I was really surprised that she'd never done any before. And she said, well, she had a family of 12 kids, and the motion was just like slicing carrots. And so she had a lot of practice. And it worked out well. Now, another thing that you might find helpful is sometimes it's going to be difficult to do this type of cut, and you can switch to another one called a levering cut, where you take and place your left thumb on the back of the knife, and then just use that as a pivot point. See, I'm not really using my arm, I'm just sort of levering the wood away with a little wrist action. This gives you a lot of control, and it's not very hard to do. Sometimes when I'm carving along, I'll switch from one to the other without even thinking about it, and that gives you a nice, comfortable change of pace. The thing you have to be careful of when you're carving here is remember to always carve with the grain. Now, with this project, the grain runs from his feet up to the top of his head, and that makes the legs very strong. But one of the problems you run into is places like this along his feet, you have very short grain here. Or when we get into the hat, we'll have a similar problem. This can be very fragile down here, so you want to be careful just to take tiny chips when you're working down here and not split off too much wood. Other than that, when you're working with the grain, it's just a matter of when you're carving, if you're carving someplace and you feel a knife start to dig in, don't go any farther, just stop and approach it from a different direction. That's really all there is to it. Sometimes you see in the westerns, in the old movies, some guy sitting on a corner, he's doing this with his knife. And that looks good in the movies, but don't try to do it on these guys because you can't, once again, you're using your arm motion, and you can't really get any control on that. If the knife slips, it's going to hit your bench or whatever. So remember, just do it with your hands. There's an old woodcarver's adage that says 3 small chips are better than 1 big one. So whenever you're carving, remember that. Take your time, take it slow and easy, don't rush it. Just get into the flow of it and really get into the enjoyment of it and work along with the wood. Don't fight the wood. Just work along in cooperation with it. And pretty soon you'll just have an instinct and you'll know what to do. Now for carving the arms here and into the elbow, I'm just going to make a series of small notches working down into that section. Once again, there's a temptation to get impatient and try and take off too much wood. And sometimes that's where accidents happen. Just take it slow and easy. Sometimes I'll even brace my thumb with my left thumb to hold it in place when I'm carving in an awkward area. But notice those are just small chips. I'm not really taking a lot off. And if you take too much off, you hear a little crunch there, and you get a piece in your hand. That's what happens if you accidentally go against the grain. One of the things when making a project like this, I try to leave a lot of extra wood, and that way you've got plenty of wood to play around with. Anyway, just keep taking off small chips, and pretty soon you'll have that elbow carved right out. One of the areas that causes a little problem with this one, and you have to be exceptionally careful, is carving the hat. And that's because the hat brim is thin and can be rather fragile. The way I found that works the best with that is take and round off the hat from the top, and then take a pencil, and we'll just take and draw around about where the lower part of the hat brim would be. I'm going to angle it so the hat kind of flips up at the end. He always wore his hat tilted back at a little bit of an angle, sort of a stylish look for the wilderness. And then just take and start carving away the top part of the brim and forming the crown. Now, French Louie was kind of an interesting person. In his day, they said that he was famous all the way from Boonville to North River. And first time I heard that, that didn't impress me very much until I looked on the map and found out that his range of territory from Boonville to North River was like 80 miles of trackless wilderness. I don't know if there's hardly any roads through there now. And he used to work as a guide from time to time and take hunters and fishermen up into the woods. But mostly he enjoyed a life as a hermit. As I understand it, he got off the stage in Indian Lake one day, sometime in the 1850s, and no one knows exactly where he came from. He claims he didn't know himself, and he just spent the next 50 years living and roaming in the woods. Sometimes he'd come into town about once a year for supplies. And he'd come into town and he'd have a little money from working as a guide or whatever. And he would buy his sacks of flour. Then he'd go on a notorious spree and buy drinks for everyone in the town. And then at the end of the day, he'd take his flour and go back up in the woods for another year. So anyway, just keep doing this for carving the hat. And when you get the crown done, to carve the lower part, you could take a knife and work in there. But what happens is this section right here is going to be very fragile. And the pressure of putting the knife in here can sometimes break that off. An easier way is to take a coping saw. Now this is just a saw with a very thin blade stretched out in a metal frame. And you take that and just cut a small line around there. Not very deep, about 1/4 of an inch. And so on. Just work all the way around the bottom part of the brim. Then you take your pocket knife and just very carefully slice that wood right up to it. Eventually you'll come up with a piece that looks something like this. And this is one where we've gone around, we've smoothed up the hat brim and around the top there. The arms have been carved away here. We have the notches cut. And he's all ready for detailing the face. The important thing to remember in detailing the face on one of these carvings is work with the general shape and the general features first, and then do the details. So we've got it kind of around here, around the sides. And the first thing I'm going to do is take and cut a notch for the eyes. I'm going to use this pointed knife here for this. Now the eyes normally come about halfway between the top of a person's head and their jaw. Now in this case, he's got a hat and a beard, and this distance still works out about the same. Sometimes if he didn't have the hat but only had the beard, you might have to sort of, guess and eyeball that just a little bit. The nose comes down about 1/4 of an inch below that. And we'll just make a notch there. I'm making a stop cut. That is a vertical cut here, so when I carve here, the chip will stop instead of taking off his nose. And do that, I'm just sort of pressing down and rocking my knife back and forth. Don't use a lot of power on this. It isn't necessary. Just take it sort of gentle and slow and easy. For doing the eyes here and the nose, I want to make sure my knife is extra sharp. So I'm going to hone it up just a little bit here. To do that, I'm going to use this thing called a strop. This is just a piece of leather tacked onto a board, and you take and just rub the knife against that. Now sometimes I'll take a little jeweler's rouge and just give it a little grit on here, and that makes it sharpen just a little faster. This is for the final polishing of an already sharp blade, and it just really gives you that perfect edge. I usually sharpen about 10 times on each side. Now notice I'm making the knife go away from the cutting edge here. I'm not cutting into the leather. If you go this way, it's going to cut the leather and it's going to wreck your strop and dull your knife. This will give you a perfect razor sharp edge, and that's what you want to have for doing this detailing around the face. If your knife isn't perfectly sharp, when you start carving on this soft pine, instead of cutting the fibers, it'll crush them and make a lot of splinters. First thing we're going to do is start his nose here. And I'll do that by taking and incising a line. I'm holding the knife in something called a pencil grip. And just brace it with your finger. And when you're carving something like this, you can always brace one of your other fingers or part of your hand against the work, and that steadies it. I'm just going to draw a little line down there for his nose. Doesn't have to go very deep. You know, maybe a 1/16 of an inch is all you really need. And I'll take and bring it down this side for his nose. Then you just take and use this levering cut and pare away the wood on either side of the nose. What's interesting about this carving is the whole thing is done with just these two knife techniques. This paring cut and the levering cut. We'll shape around his cheek a little bit there. And I'll come around here and I'll do the other side. Remember, take off tiny little slices here. This is one where the rule of 3 small chips being better than 1 big one is really true. And we'll come along here. We'll make a cut for the cheek. And there we go. I just sort of smooth up his head a little bit. This is really very satisfying. There's something very soothing about just making these small chips and watching this thing take shape. Now, we're ready to start doing the eyes. Once again, I'll take the knife and the pencil grip and just incise a little line for the lower eyelid and a little line for the upper eyelid. Now, these aren't very deep. Once again, you're only going down maybe a 1/64 of an inch or less, just a little tiny cut. Takes a sharp knife and just a slow, steady pace. Then, and using our levering cut again, just pare away the tiniest little slice underneath that eyelid. Don't go too deep, or you'll chip out the eye. This shaving I'm taking off is so thin you can actually see light through it. That forms the bottom part of the lid. When we come up here, this will form the top part of the lid. Now, see how thin that chip was? We'll do it on the other side here as well. Remember, take the levering cut. Just pare around under that. If you decide you need to go deeper, then you can make 2 or 3 cuts. But once again, just make them small. I mean, you can always go a little deeper, but if you've gone too deep, you can't go shallower. Trim up his nose a little bit here. And there we go. Now to do the pupil, once again I'll use this pencil grip and make a little triangular cut in the lower part of the eyelid. This is a technique similar to the chip carving we'll be talking about later on. Here. There we go. We've got a little guy looking back at us. Then you just finish shaping around the beard and so forth. For doing the clothes, let me just show you a little trick here. You can take a pencil and draw in where the clothes will be. And then you can take your knife and holding it in the pencil grip, make a little cut down there. Now, if you happen to have a small V tool, well, like this little small 3mm V gouge, this is just a tool that has a flat side on each side that meets in the center to form a point. You can also use this, and you can take and make your cut around there and come up around here too. I'll keep my hand out of the way in case if I slip there. And you cut a little line there, and then take your knife and then just slice away the wood underneath that. See, and that gives you a little step down from here to here. Just repeat that on the other side, and eventually what you'll have is a guy that looks kind of like this. And see, we have a little step down on each side. For texturing the beard, you can use your knife and a pencil grip and incise little lines there, or once again, you can take a small V tool and holding it like a pencil, take and incise little lines there. For carving the ear, it comes about from the top of the eyebrows, or top of the eyelids, down to the bottom of the nose. And for this, just take the knife and hold it in the pencil grip, incise your lines around it like you did with the eye, and then just slice away the wood on either side. For the hands, form the cuffs first, and you just work the knife down with a stop cut here and then pare away the excess on either side. And for doing the hand, once again, don't worry about the details. Concentrate on the general shape first. Take your own hand and hold it in a position like you'd be if you were holding an axe. And then look at the shapes. You have a flat side here and it comes down to an angle. And you have your hand coming up here with a sort of a lump of a thumb on this side. Just concentrate on these general shapes and duplicate those as best you can in the carving. And then when you have the general shapes to where you want it, then you can take your little V gouge and incise 3 lines to form the fingers and shape around the thumb. For the cuffs, we do the same thing. On the pants, we just make a line around there, pare away the excess, and that's really all there is to it. Gee, I love that guy. He is so neat. The last thing you'll want to do is paint him. Let me show you a trick on painting him here. I generally use oil colors. And those are those colors that come in a tube. For doing this guy, we'll use Prussian blue and a little burnt umber for his pants. Then we'll use some burnt sienna and red for his shirt, and burnt umber for his shoes and his hat. And that gives you a nice mellow color. To mix this paint, just take and squeeze out a little dab of burnt umber or Prussian blue in this case. I'm going to do his pants here. And I find that Prussian blue is pretty intense, so I dull it down with a little burnt umber. You take your paint thinner or turpentine and just mix a few drops in there. And just drag a little of this color into where you're mixing it. Now see, that Prussian blue is pretty intense, so I'm going to just dull it down with a little burnt umber and gray it down a bit. And I'll thin it out a bit more. French Louis generally wore some fairly rustic clothes, and they were often faded. So this gives a nice color. You take a little chip or something and you can double check to see how bright your color is. I'm going to put a couple more drops in there and thin it down even more. When you get the consistency of the color to where you want it, you can see where I started it here. It gives it kind of a nice little stain. And lets the wood grain show through. And just put that on. This is called a tint, because you're just sort of very lightly staining the wood with these colors. This is a type of painting technique that you often see in Europe, up in the Bavarian mountains or in the Alps. I don't use watercolors on these carvings for the simple reason that the water tends to make the fibers of the wood swell, and it causes what is called raising the grain, and it can make the wood look kind of fuzzy. When you're using an oil color stain, that doesn't happen. So anyway, just go ahead and paint the rest of the guy like that, and you're all set. And there we have our French Louis. What's neat about this technique is we just use a couple simple knife cuts, and you can do so many things with it. Here's a couple other projects I've done using the very same techniques here. This is a carving detail from an old photograph dating back to the 1800s, and his name was Alva Dunning, and he was a guide up around the Adirondack Mountains, and I guess he was really quite a character. This person next to him is a camp cook, and once again, this detail from old photographs. The people that knew her said that she was really a nice, sweet gal, but she could keep the lumberjacks in line. This last guy is a person that I met hiking up in Switzerland last summer, and I was going up this trail, and he was coming down with this blue and white striped walking stick, and I thought, hey, he looks like he'd make kind of a neat person for a wood carving. So I snapped a photograph of him, came back, drew up a pattern, and carved him out of wood. You can really do anything with the style. It's a lot of fun. I think you'll have a lot of fun with it. Next week, we're going to be going back to the gouges, and we're going to make this carving of an Adirondack loon. One of my favorites, and it'll be a lot of fun. So get your whittling tool sharpened up, and until next week, this is Rick Butz wishing you happy carving.
You can continue to learn wood carving with Rick Butz with his book, How to Carve Wood. This 224-page book of challenging exercises and projects is full of detailed instructions. Lessons include whittling, wildlife carving, and relief carving. To order your copy, call 1-800-950-9648.
Woodcraft, for all your woodworking needs. Tools, supplies, lumber, project plans, and educational workshops. With a mail-order catalog and stores nationwide. Woodcraft, helping you make wood work.